So good morning, everyone. Happy Sabbath. Glad to have the opportunity to speak again with you all. So I know I spoke here last Sabbath, so I'm glad to have the opportunity again. Hopefully we can all gain a blessing from what we'll be going over today. So as we're looking at the title here, what I'll be talking about today is how we as Christians should respond in different situations, how Christ wants us to act. Because we talked about it a little bit in the lesson today about the times of trial and persecution that are coming, and I think we're all here are familiar with that. But there will be times of persecution coming, times of war and rumors of war, and so we should know what our reaction should be in those times, to where when those times come, we know what God expects of us, and we have an intelligent faith, and we can know what we believe and defend our position. Morning and welcome. So as we get started here, I'd like to see what the Lord is wanting of us as His children. So I'll be starting in John chapter 14 and verse 21. It says, "He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me. And he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him and will manifest myself to him." So here Christ is speaking about His followers, and He talks specifically about them as if they're keeping their commandments, it is He that loveth me. Because if we love the Father, then we'll have the love for His children as well. And so as we act, we'll be acting out the 10 Commandments. But we see more than that if we go to Revelation. The end of Revelation, after the end of the conflict, we're looking now at the new heavens and new earth. It says, "Blessed are they that do His commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city." So we see here that those who keep the commandments are those who will be able to be with the Lord in heaven. It says that they'll have the right to the tree of life. And not that we're saved by keeping the commandments, because we know that we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, but we know that through Christ, He will, through His imparted righteousness, we'll be saved. But we see that this is something that God expects of us. And so as we're thinking about the commandments that we're looking at, that I think we're all familiar with how important they are. There's one that we're all familiar with, and it's the commandment that thou shalt not kill. In Exodus 20, it's where the Lord is giving the commandments to the children of Israel from Mount Sinai. And the question that we have when we're looking at this commandment is very short, very simple, but we don't know how to apply it. When it says, like, thou shalt not kill, like, is that always? Are there exceptions where sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not? Or is it absolute? So that's what I'll be going through today, what the Christian's stance should be, specifically to this commandment, thou shalt not kill. So because this is particularly important for like wartime service, because as I think we're probably all familiar with the history of the Reform movement. A lot of the fathers of our church, that was one of their distinct stands. And so I want us to be able to understand the position now and be able to share it ourselves. And so specifically thinking about it in terms of conscientious objection in times of war, we'll be looking at that today also. But when we become a Christian, we should understand that as we do that, we are becoming soldiers. But we'll see that it's a different kind. So if we go to 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, "Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." So we're to be soldiers, but soldiers for Christ. And when we look at Ephesians chapter 6, Paul explains more about what this warfare looks like. It says in verse 12 of chapter 6 in Ephesians, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So the warfare that we're in, the conflict that we're in, the great controversy, it's not a physical struggle, but it's a spiritual struggle. Satan and his forces and Christ and his forces are battling for us and those around us. And that's the battle that we're in. And we see that when we look at the words of Christ. In John 18, when he's talking with Pilate in one of his trials, court trials, I mean, it says, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." So he's talking to Pilate here, and the point he's making is that his kingdom isn't a worldly kingdom that would need to be defended. Like, his disciples aren't going to be fighting. We'll look in a bit about the example of Peter when he did try to defend his Lord and what the Lord said about that. But the main point is that Christ's kingdom isn't of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom, and it'll come down to this earth at his second coming. But now in our time, it's not of this world yet, and we're not to advance it through fighting like that. And we see if we go to Hebrews chapter 11, some people it's commonly referred to as like the faith chapter. It's where it's talking about those who had faith in the Old Testament as an example for us. But after it's talking about several of the patriarchs, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country." So, since the kingdom of Christ is heavenly, we're here, but our primary purpose in life should be looking forward to heaven. We saw that in the lesson. I don't think we really discussed it much, but it was mentioned in there as well. I think it was in the suggested reading. But that's to be our purpose, to be further in Christ's kingdom. But it says here, going back to Hebrews, it's talking about strangers and pilgrims on the earth. What does that mean? If we continue on, it says, "And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city." So as the patriarchs then, we are to be now looking forward to a better land and not looking back to things of this world and being distracted by them. If we look, Paul uses the same wording, referring to us as pilgrims and strangers in 1 Peter. I said Paul, I'm sorry, it's Peter. He says in one of his letters, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." So as we're looking to the heavenly kingdom, we're to be pilgrims and strangers here. And what that means is that our primary focus shouldn't be here. Our primary allegiance shouldn't be here. But we're citizens of heaven. So as we'll see, we're to respect the authorities here, but our primary citizenship is heavenly. So as we continue on thinking about what this means with our first allegiance being in heaven, Paul in 2 Timothy says the following. He says, "Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." And we saw this verse earlier. But it continues, "No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier." So here Paul is using the analogy of like on earth what soldiers, how they act, but we're to do the same. Notice that it says that they're not to be entangled with the affairs of this life. We shouldn't be so distracted by the things of this world that we lose sight of the eternal interests. And that's why if we look in 2 Corinthians that we're to be separate. It says, "Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you." And then we have the promise, if we do that, it continues in verse 18, it says, "And will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. So we're to separate from the world. And now this verse is talking about, it's very broad in application. You can talk about many things, the wickedness that's in the world and things of that nature. But what I'd like us to think about this verse today is in regard to how we view our allegiances to the governments here versus our first allegiance, which should be to heaven. Now, with this kind of background, I'd like to look at what the Bible says about how we're to act to our enemies, those who were taught, I guess, in modern society that we would need to fight or combat against. But what does Christ want us to do? Because we should remember that we're all God's children, and keep that in mind as we're looking at these verses. So I'd like to start in Matthew chapter 5. This is on the Sermon on the Mount. And Christ says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." So he's saying, this is what you have in the Ten Commandments, but then he's broadening it, taking the principle and expanding it. Well, not expanding it, but helping explain to them what it was talking about. That wasn't just talking about killing. It says in verse 22, "But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka," or like worthless one, says, "shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire." So Christ is saying that it goes beyond just killing, like the physical act, but what is in our hearts? Do we have anger or hatred, or just like in the last part of 22 where it says, "Whosoever shall say, Thou fool"? It's talking about the heart, like we were talking in the Sabbath school. It's like the attitude as well, not just what you're actually doing, but in the heart as well. It goes broader than just the act. And if we go to 1 John, we see why that is. Here it says, "Whosoever hateth his brother is a murderer," because going back to what's in your heart. It says, "And ye know that no murderer hath eternal life abiding in him." So when we're looking at the Ten Commandments and thinking of how specifically the commandment that we shouldn't kill, how we're to interpret that, Christ is broadening it. And again, like I said earlier, not that he's making it broader as a new thing, but just how the Ten Commandments, when they were given to the children of Israel, all the laws that were given in addition in the rest of Exodus, it was to help explain the Ten Commandments. And Christ is doing the same in the Gospels. He's helping the people to understand what the principle behind the Ten Commandments. And so that's what we were saying earlier. But if we go back to Matthew chapter 5, we see what Christ is calling his people to be. Christ says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." So we're not to hate each other, but we're to be a peacemaker. And if we go to Romans chapter 12, Paul talks about this in another way, not just from the peace side, but what we're to do, with the enemies that we do have. This is in Romans chapter 12. It'll be verse 14 and then jumping to 17 and 18. It says, "Bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not." So this is contrary to what we're kind of socially programmed to do. But Paul continues. He says, "Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, so much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men." So we're not to, if somebody does something bad against us, we're not to go and do something bad back. We're not to recompense evil for evil, but we're to, as much as lieth in us, live peaceably with all men. And that goes back to what Christ was saying too, where he was exhorting the people to be peacemakers in the Beatitudes that we read in Matthew chapter 5. And if we continue to verses 20 and 21 in the same chapter here in Romans, Paul continues, "Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And this is very counter of what we see in society, of what people do just from human nature. If you have somebody who's an enemy against you, and which we know that we shouldn't have an enemy ourselves, because we're to have the love of Christ, and we should want to reach souls wherever they are, whoever they are. So I don't think Paul's talking about an enemy on our side. I think it's clear that he's talking about an enemy, somebody who thinks of us as an enemy. But he says in verse 20, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. And then if he's thirsty, give him drink. And this is just totally against what we see. And that's why in the end of verse 20 it says, for in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. So not that you're like doing this physically, but just in like what they're going to take from this. And it'll be a witness to them. So if we go back to Matthew now, back to Matthew chapter 5, which we were at earlier, but a couple of verses later, Christ is saying similar things there about what we are to do to our enemies. So this is Christ speaking. It says, but I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And then in verse 45 it says that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. So it goes further than just, not going where we read earlier, recompensing evil for evil. But it says if they're despitefully using you, then pray for them. And if they're persecuting you, to do the same. It says, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. We're not to retaliate, returning evil for evil. And then it continues in verse 46. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So here it goes back to the social structure. Well, what we're taught, and what human nature tells us, be nice to those who are nice to you. But Christ is saying that's even the publicans do that. We're called to do more. We're to love our enemies as well, not just those who share that love back towards us. And we see a similar sentiment in Luke. This is Christ again. It says, but I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you. So similar to what we were reading in Matthew. It says, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. And unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. And what I think we kind of we read this, or thinking of myself before I studied it more, we think about like, oh, if somebody's like, attacking us or trying to take something from us, like we should defend ourselves. Don't take that from me. And we read this, but we don't really apply it. We don't really think about it of what Christ is saying. But he says in verse 29, unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. It's hard to wrap your head around. It's not what we want to do out of human nature. It says, in him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. So think about this in the context of like self-defense. We already saw earlier, we're not to return evil for evil. But also if somebody's attacking you, not that you can't, run away or something, but we're not to return evil for evil. We're not to smite them back. But it says to turn the other cheek. But then also if we're thinking about like, what about defending somebody else maybe? Okay, somebody's getting attacked, what should we do then? And keep in mind that, Christ calls us to be peacemakers. So, there's a place for like, intervening to help. But what does that mean for retaliating with violence? Let's look to the example of Peter. I had mentioned it earlier, but what about when Christ was being taken? Peter was going to defend Christ. And we see this in Matthew chapter 26. And the other Gospels, it names Peter as this disciple that we're going to read about. But it says, and behold, one of them, which were with Jesus, stretched out his hand and drew his sword, and struck a servant of the high priest's and smote off his ear. So he pulls out his sword. He's like, we're gonna fight to make sure Christ isn't taken. But then Jesus said unto him, put up again thy sword into his place. For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. So he wasn't just saying, my time has come. It's time for, I've told you that the time of my crucifixion is coming. Don't hold me back from that. They're going to take me. It's what needs to be done. But he's not saying don't defend me for that reason. But then he adds this broad, the principle here that for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. It's not just because it was time for him to be crucified. And we see that if we go to Romans chapter 12, we had read several verses there already, but we see there that it's Paul speaking, but through inspiration of the Lord. It says, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So we're not to avenge ourselves. We're to trust it in the Lord's hands and know that he will both protect us, but also take vengeance for the wrong things that are done to us, either in this life now or in the judgment to come. So, but now thinking about for wartime service as well. So it's clear, the verses we've been looking at in the Gospels where Christ is saying that we're not to recompense evil for evil. We're not to fight against our enemies, but we're to pray for them. We're to feed them, give them drink, and pray for them. But keep in mind too, we saw this verse earlier, that Christ is saying that his kingdom isn't of this world. Remember that our first allegiance is to Christ and not the earthly kingdoms, because we're pilgrims and strangers, in which we saw that earlier in Acts 11:13. But the question is, in which people have had to face in the past, in which I just from prophecy we know that there's going to be wars and rumors of war, and so I would be surprised if we don't have a draft in the future. That's just me speculating. But if that's the case and we're drafted to fight, what should our response be? Because we'll look in a little bit about how we should act towards our authorities. We are to respect the authorities that we have. But what happens when they call us to do something that we know from the Scripture isn't what the Lord wants us to do? We should give the same answer that the apostles did from the example that they gave us in Acts chapter 5. Because this is when they were taken by the Jewish leaders. So in verse 28, this is the Jewish leader speaking. It says, saying, did not we straitly command you that you should not teach in this name? They were forbidding them to preach in the name of Christ. It continues, and behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. So they were commanding them, hey, don't share the gospel, don't preach this, in which there's many places in the world where that's the case now. You're commanded, you can't proselytize, or you can't share your beliefs. But how did they respond, and how should we respond when the state tells us to do something that is against what God tells us to do? It says, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So if we're called upon to do something that we know isn't right from the Bible, we should stand for what's right, even though it's coming from an authority over us. And we'll see that when we come to Romans chapter 13 on how we're to act with respect to our authorities, and we'll come there in a minute. But the thing we need to keep in mind, because we think back to in the Old Testament when the people of Israel were called to fight. The Lord sometimes, he would tell them, go and attack this people and destroy them. How should we interpret that in light of what we were reading in the Gospels about, loving your enemies, things like that? Why was the Lord asking them to do that? So what we should think about first is, did the Lord need them to do that? Was that his intention? Did he need them to be the ones fighting the enemies? If we see that, and if we go to Exodus 23, 27 to 30, we'll see that it wasn't the Lord's intent for the people to fight their way into Canaan against the different Canaanite peoples. This is in Exodus 23, 27 to 30. This is before they entered the promised land but had left Egypt. It says, this is the Lord speaking, it says, I will send my fear before thee, and will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come. And I will make all thine enemies turn their backs unto thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. Continues, I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, and the beasts of the field multiply against thee. So he won't even push them all out at once, but he'll do it in stages to where the land doesn't grow up. It says, by little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. But the previous verses that we were looking at, the Lord is saying that this is something that he will do. He will put out the people. It even mentions he'll send hornets before thee to move the people out. So the Lord was wanting to do this work for them. But we know from the history of Israel, when they had to go in the 40 years in the wilderness, when they came back to Canaan, then because of the hardness of their hearts earlier, and the reason why they needed to go in the 40 years, because of their sin then, they had the consequences of having to fight their way in. It wasn't the same as when they were going in at first. But we see here in Exodus that it wasn't the Lord's intent that they should be the ones fighting. But also, if we go to Genesis chapter 19, if we're thinking about that the Lord didn't need them to do the fighting. He doesn't. There's examples when he would do it himself. He didn't need the people to do it. In Genesis 19, we have the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sure we're all familiar with that story. It was a wicked people, and the Lord destroyed them in judgment himself. We see this in Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25. It says, then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. So not all punishment the Lord used the children of Israel to do. He didn't have to use them to do that. And we see another example even during the time of Israel. And I'm going to kind of bring this together why I'm showing you these examples. But another place during the time when the children of Israel were in Canaan, they were established there. It was actually after the kingdoms had split between the northern and southern kingdom in the time of Hezekiah. There was a time when the Assyrians came and they attacked Israel, or well, it was Judah, the children of Israel, but the southern kingdom of Judah. And this is the Lord speaking. It says, for I will defend the city to save it, for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. So the Lord's saying this is something that he will do. And then we see him doing this in verse 35. It says, and it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 184,500. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So the Lord is able to do the destruction that sometimes you'd call the children of Israel to do. So the question is, why were the Israelites commanded to do those different things in different times in their history? And I think how we can understand what the children of Israel were to do is to look at how the Lord uses the governments today. And so we're going to go to Romans chapter 13. This is the spot I was mentioning earlier where it talks about our responsibility to the authorities over us. And once we look at those verses, it'll help us see why the Lord was using Israel then and how that's different for us now. So if we go to Romans chapter 13, it'll be verses 1 through 4. Paul says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. So the Lord has his hand in setting up these powers over us. Verse 2, it says, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. And remember this in light of Acts chapter 5 that we saw earlier. up to when they tell you to do something that's against what God says, and then we're to obey God rather than man. And we have the example too of, think back in the Old Testament about like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were told to do something against the government. For the three of them, the case of worship, well, and even really Daniel for worship as well. And they followed God rather than the governments. And that's when there's a conflict. But other than that conflict, we see here that we're to respect the authorities over us. But it continues. It says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same." But then verse 4 is where it's interesting, and we can see insights on how we can understand how Israel was used in the past. In verse 4 it says, "For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." So he's a minister, or like a servant, a tool in God's hand, pretty much, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Remember the verse I showed, it was from Romans 12, and it was talking about how we're not to avenge ourselves, but how God says that vengeance is mine. That was in Romans 12:19. And so Romans 12 only has I think it was maybe 22 verses. So then we're just after in the Romans 13. And remember that there weren't verses and chapter breaks in the original. So he's saying, don't take, God's saying vengeance is mine. We're not to avenge ourselves. And then Paul says that the state, the governments are here to be for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So these governments are God's tool to avenge his people or those who do wrong. So with that in mind, think back now to the Israelites. When they were to attack different countries back then, we can understand it in the same way. God was using them as a tool to execute judgment on the different nations, because that was a theocracy back then. The Lord was leading the people. Well, when it came to the times of the kings, they were starting to reject the Lord. I don't have the verse in the slides, but when they were wanting to have Saul set up and Samuel was telling them not to, the Lord was saying that they're not rejecting you, Samuel, as the judge of Israel, but they're rejecting me. So that was kind of starting to the phase of turning. But in the time of the theocracy, the Lord was leading the country, and he was using them, like here it's talking about the governments are used today, as a tool to execute vengeance on those who have done wrong, or the countries when they had reached the limit of their sin. But now thinking about that today, that's not an excuse for us to participate in war now, because it'd be fighting with worldly governments against other countries. I mean, it could be against our own brothers and sisters from other countries fighting, if they're fighting in their army and we're doing the same. It's different now since it's not a theocracy and the Lord isn't using the children of Israel to punish the nations around them. And we see that if we, for an example, if we go to Numbers 31, this is a time where this was before they had entered Israel. It says, "The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. Afterward shalt thou be gathered unto thy people." So he's saying that the children of Israel were to avenge the Midianites. And remember that was something that the Lord said that he would do for them. And it's not contrary to what Christ was saying in the Gospels that we were reading. Because in Leviticus 19, 17, and 18, it says, "Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thine heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor and not suffer sin upon him." So you're to help him. Then in 18 it says, "Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord." So it's still the same thing back then, that they weren't to avenge themselves. But we see in verse 31 that the Lord would use them as the nation to be his tool to avenge those who were in sin. But the same principle applied individually. Whoops, sorry, I went the wrong way. Still applied. Oh, man. Oh, wow. I'm sorry, I jumped a lot. So it's still applied the same way where individually you weren't to avenge yourselves. We see that here in Leviticus 19 that I shared earlier. And that makes sense as we're looking at the verse we saw already. It's different now since the kingdom of Christ isn't of this world. It's a heavenly kingdom. It's not a theocracy, a theocratic government here on earth. And so when we're called to participate in war, it's not the same as when the children of war fought then, because we're not executing God's judgment according to his command, but we're just fighting against one another. And that's not how we're to treat our enemies, as we saw earlier in the Gospels. But along the same lines of it being a heavenly kingdom, we know in Galatians 3:29 that it's not just the children of Abraham that are Christ's people now, physically, the physical children of Abraham. But it says in Galatians chapter 3, it says, "And if ye be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise." So this is why the kingdom of Israel, it isn't an earthly government. It's God's people here on earth. And that's the change when the gospel went out to the Gentiles. The time that was set aside for the Israelites. I think we're all familiar with the time prophecy, the 490 years for them. Well, a little bit before starting with the stoning of Stephen, but the message went out, and it was no longer the nation of Israel that people would come to, but it was now a church in the world. And that's just showing the difference then between now, kind of helping explain what might seem to be a contradiction between the Old Testament, what the Lord used the children of Israel for, with the New Testament of what Christ was saying. But we see that it's still the same. That the Lord didn't want them to have that hatred to one another and recompense evil for evil. So I pray that we understand what the Lord expects of us, to where especially the times that are coming ahead that we know are coming, we'll know what we believe, and when the time comes, we'll know how to act. Because like we were talking about in the Sabbath school, the time to prepare and know what you believe is now, not when the trial comes. Because when it comes, you'll make excuses. You'll to do whatever you will be easiest if you don't know what you believe. So I hope that we know better what the Bible says and what we believe, and that we'll be one of the ones that are counted here heirs according to the promise by accepting Christ. That's my prayer. Amen.